A mother, two little girls, and an unborn child, wiped from existence in a single morning. A father, standing in front of news cameras, begging for their safe return. The world watched, searching for answers. Friends, neighbors, and even law enforcement clung to the hope that this was all just a terrible misunderstanding. But as the hours passed, that hope faded. The husband who appeared desperate for help held a secret he couldn't contain. A secret buried beneath layers of lies, deception, and an image of a devoted family man he had carefully constructed. The woman who loved him was gone. Their daughters, who once ran to him with open arms, were silenced forever. And the man responsible for it all? He stood before the world, playing the role of a grieving husband, knowing exactly what he had done. How does a man go from holding his children in his arms to taking their lives? What led Chris Watts to make the decision that shattered an entire family? And why did he believe he could get away with it? The truth is buried beneath confessions, lies, and a trail of evidence that tells a story far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. This is the real story of what happened to Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico, the truth behind the mask Chris Watts wore so well. Frederick, Colorado, August 13, 2018. A seemingly normal morning in a small, quiet town. But inside this home, something had already gone terribly wrong. Shanann Watts, a devoted mother, was supposed to be at a routine doctor's appointment that morning. She never showed up. She wasn't answering her phone. And for her best friend, Nicole Atkinson, that was a red flag that couldn't be ignored. Nicole had been the last person to see Shanann alive. She had dropped her off at home just hours earlier, after a late-night business trip. Shanann had been exhausted but relieved to be home, looking forward to reuniting with her daughters. But now, something was wrong. Nicole called. No answer. She texted. No response. Panic began to set in. She drove to the Watts home and knocked on the door. Silence. But something caught her eye, Shanann's car, parked in the driveway. If she had left on her own, why would she leave her phone, her purse, her car, everything she needed? A sense of dread settled in. She knew Shanann. She knew her habits. She knew this wasn't normal. And so, she did the only thing she could, she called 911. The officer arrived at the Watts home within minutes. Chris Watts pulled into the driveway shortly after, looking visibly confused. When asked about his wife's whereabouts, his answers were vague. He claimed Shanann had taken the girls to a friend's house after an emotional conversation about their marriage. But something felt off. His demeanor. His tone. His lack of urgency. The officers weren't convinced, and neither was Nicole. Inside the house, there was no sign of a struggle. No blood. No broken glass. No overturned furniture. And yet, something was very wrong. Shanann's phone was found stuffed in the couch. Her purse sat untouched on the kitchen counter. The girls' favorite blankets they never slept without, were missing. Something had happened inside this house. Something Chris Watts wasn't saying. And soon, investigators would uncover the horrifying truth, one that would shock the world and turn a picture-perfect family into the center of a nightmare no one could have imagined. The story was just beginning. Chris Watts, news clip. I want them back. Like, this house is just empty without them. I don't know where they went. If someone has them, please bring them back. Just hours after his pregnant wife and two daughters vanished without a trace, Chris Watts stood in front of cameras, pleading for their safe return. His words should have carried the desperation of a terrified husband and father. But something was missing: fear, grief, urgency. Instead, there was detachment. His face unreadable, his arms crossed protectively over his chest. To the public, he looked like a man holding in his emotions. To investigators, he looked like a man with something to hide. In cases like these, the first 24 hours are crucial. Investigators meticulously examined Chris's statements, looking for inconsistencies. And there were plenty. He said Shannon left with the girls, but she had left behind everything: her phone, her purse, even the medication she needed daily for her lupus. That didn't make sense. And then, there was the neighbor's surveillance footage. A single clip that shattered his story. The video showed Chris at 5:27 a.m., backing his truck into the driveway, loading something into the back, not once, but 3 times. Alone. No sign of Shannon. No sign of the girls. "Officer. Chris, that's you. That's your truck. What are you loading?" "Chris. Just some tools for work." But something wasn't right. His movements were too careful, too deliberate. The officer noticed his breathing quicken. His body stiffen. His gaze darted nervously to the screen. Chris was watching himself lie. As investigators dug deeper into Chris's life, a new revelation emerged, one that changed everything. Chris Watts wasn't the devoted husband he appeared to be. He was living a double life. Through phone records, authorities discovered hundreds of calls and texts between Chris and a woman named Nicole Kessinger, a co-worker he had been secretly dating for weeks. Nicole later told police that Chris had portrayed himself as a man in a loveless marriage. A husband about to leave his wife. A father eager to start fresh. He told her Shannon was controlling, that she dictated every aspect of his life, from what he wore to what he ate. He claimed he was trapped, that he had finally found someone who truly made him happy. In reality, Shannon had no idea her husband was planning a new life, without her. Chris had searched for ways to start over, but there was one thing in his way: his family. Financial struggles and mounting pressure. The cracks in the Watts family didn't start with an affair. Long before Chris met Nicole Kessinger, there was pressure. Bills. Debt. Arguments behind closed doors. In 2015, Chris and Shannon had filed for bankruptcy. They owed nearly $70,000 in unpaid credit cards, medical bills, and student loans. They were living paycheck to paycheck, struggling to keep up the image of a perfect suburban life. Shannon had taken charge of their finances, working tirelessly to sell health supplements while balancing life as a mother. She was ambitious, determined, always pushing forward. But Chris was slipping away. A Facebook post from Shannon. "I married the best man. The best dad. He's my rock." To the world, Shannon's life looked picture perfect. To Chris, it was suffocating. He was no longer the man in control. August 15, 2018, 2 days after Shannon and her daughters were reported missing, the walls were closing in on Chris Watts. Investigators had already spotted the holes in his story. The surveillance footage. The missing financial records. The discovery of his affair. But they needed more. Chris had agreed to take a polygraph test, a decision that would prove to be his undoing. His confidence wavered as he was hooked up to the machine, his breathing shallow, his fingers twitching with nerves. And then came the questions. Examiner, interrogation footage. "Do you know where Shannon is right now?" Chris. "No." Examiner. "Did you physically cause Shannon's disappearance?" Chris. "No." Narrator. But the machine didn't believe him. Tammy Lee, the polygraph examiner, knew it instantly. The sharp spikes in his heart rate. The increase in stress levels. She had done thousands of these tests before, and she knew Chris Watts was lying. And when the test was over, she didn't hold back. Examiner, interrogation footage. "Chris, you failed. There's no doubt about it. You failed miserably." The confidence he had walked into the room with was gone. His breath hitched. His lips pursed. He was unraveling, and the detectives knew it. It was time to push. Chris, interrogation footage. I'll tell you what happened, but you have to promise me something. You have to promise you'll protect me. And then, the first confession came, but it wasn't the truth. Not even close. Chris broke down, sobbing into his hands. He admitted to killing Shanann. But the reason he gave? He claimed that when he told Shanann he wanted to separate, she flew into a rage. That she strangled their daughters in retaliation. And that he, in turn, killed her in a moment of uncontrollable anger. It was a story meant to paint him as a grieving father, a man pushed to the edge by a wife's unthinkable actions. But there was one problem. The evidence didn't match. Shanann's autopsy would later show no signs of a struggle. No defensive wounds. No trauma that indicated she had fought back. And most importantly, Chris's own movements on that fateful morning told a different story. The real truth. That was far more disturbing. After Chris's partial confession, detectives needed proof. They pressed him, where were Shanann and the girls? Chris hesitated. He knew what this meant. But with nowhere left to run, he gave them an answer. A remote oil field. A worksite owned by Anadarko Petroleum, where Chris had been employed for years. Investigators rushed to the location, accompanied by cadaver dogs and forensic teams. What they found was horrifying. Shanann was buried in a shallow grave, her body still clothed in a shirt that read, "Rise Above." A haunting reminder of the hopeful, determined woman she had been. But the girls? The girls weren't in the ground. Chris had hidden them inside two massive oil tanks, 4 stories high. He had forced their small bodies through an opening no wider than 8 inches, dropping them into the toxic crude oil below. It was a method designed to erase them. To dissolve evidence. To ensure that whatever he had done to them would never be known. But science had a different, with their bodies recovered, forensic experts could now uncover the real story, one that shattered every lie Chris Watts had told. Bella and Celeste had not been killed by Shanann. They had not been casualties of a heated argument. They had been murdered, by their father. And the way they died. That truth would make Chris Watts one of the most hated men in America. It wasn't until months later, after the trial, after his sentencing, after the world had already condemned him, that the full truth emerged. In a chilling 5-hour interview with investigators in February 2019, Chris Watts finally laid it all out. No more lies. No more shifting blame. Just the cold, brutal reality of what he had done. He admitted that he had already made up his mind before that fatal night. He wasn't arguing with Shanann about their marriage. He wasn't pushed to the brink. He had planned it. Thought about it for days. And when Shanann came home from her work trip in the early hours of August 13th, she was exhausted. She crawled into bed, unaware that her husband had already decided she wouldn't wake up. As the morning sun crept through the windows, Chris climbed on top of her. He pressed his hands around her throat and squeezed. She fought. Not with her fists, but with her words. Chris would later say that her final words were, "Chris, why?" But he didn't stop. He kept going until the life drained from her body. And then, in an act of cold calculation, he wrapped her in a sheet and dragged her to his truck. But what happened next? That was the part that sickened even the most hardened investigators. Bella Watts was 4 years old. Celeste was 3. They had woken up that morning to a nightmare. Their mother was gone. Their father, whom they trusted more than anyone in the world, was acting strangely. Chris put them in the truck. Celeste had no idea what was happening. Bella knew something wasn't right. As they drove to the oil site, she asked her father the question no child should ever have to ask. "Is mommy okay?" Chris said yes. He lied. And then, one by one, he killed them. First, Celeste. A blanket wrapped around her small frame as he smothered the life out of her. Bella watched. She was old enough to understand. Old enough to realize that she was next. Her final words. A whisper. A plea. "Daddy, no." But he did. And then he forced her small body into the oil tank beside her sister. Chris Watts was arrested on August 15, 2018. With the overwhelming evidence stacked against him, he had no chance of escaping justice. Rather than face a trial, he took a plea deal. On November 6, 2018, he pleaded guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for Shanann, 2 for Bella and Celeste, and 2 for their unborn son, Nico. He also pleaded guilty to 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body and 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy. The sentence? 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. 3 consecutive. 2 concurrent. Plus an additional 84 years for the lesser charges. There would be no appeals. No second chances. For Chris Watts, prison was his new reality. But for Shanann's family, there was no justice that could undo what had been done. The world watched in horror as the details of the case unfolded. Shanann's family, Frank, Sandra, and Frankie Rzusek, were shattered. The pain of losing their daughter and grandchildren in such a brutal, senseless way was unimaginable. At his sentencing, Shanann's father stood before the courtroom and looked Chris in the eye. His voice broke as he spoke. "I trusted you. We all trusted you. You destroyed everything." The judge didn't hold back either. Before handing down the sentence, he called the case the most inhumane and vicious crime he had ever encountered. And in the small town of Frederick, Colorado, the Watts family home became a symbol of tragedy. The once happy house now sat empty, a painful reminder of what had happened within its walls. Narrator. Chris Watts was transferred out of Colorado for his own safety. He now spends his days in a maximum security prison in Waupun, Wisconsin. Locked away in a tiny cell, surrounded by men who despise him, Chris Watts is no longer the charming husband, the family man he once pretended to be. He's a marked man. A baby killer. One of the most reviled inmates in the system. And yet, even behind bars, there are those who still write to him. Women who claim to love him. Who want to marry him. A chilling reminder that even the worst monsters can attract admirers. But Chris Watts will never walk free. He will never again see the outside world. And for the family he destroyed, there is no forgiveness. Only grief. Only loss. Only the lingering question. Why? The Watts family murders weren't just another crime story. They were a chilling testament to how deception can fester behind the most ordinary-looking doors. Chris Watts was not a man pushed to his breaking point. He was not a man who snapped. He was a man who made a choice. A choice to erase his family. To build a new life, one that never included the people who loved him the most. And in making that choice, he ensured that his name would forever be spoken with disgust. But Shanann's name? Bella's? Celeste's? Nico's? They will be remembered for the love they shared. The light they brought into the world. The ones who mattered. What do you think about the Watts family murders? Do you believe justice was served, or do you think there are still unanswered questions? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into true crime cases that expose the darkest corners of human nature, subscribe. Because every crime has a final truth.